Velkommen alle sammen. You all know my stance on this by now. There's just not enough written or archaeological evidence from the Viking Age to prove that there were any female warriors on the wide scale at the time. Before anyone gets upset, I'm not saying that there were no female fighters. There definitely were some feisty maidens you wouldn't want to mess with. That's exactly what this video is about. I'm going over every source of a woman engaging in violent conflict in the Viking Age, and guys, you can decide yourself based on the sources and don't just follow some agenda of some Hollywood producer, okay? But first, I would like you guys to define what a warrior is. Go ahead, I'll wait, you can all write it down in the comments. There are many vague definitions of a warrior that you can find out there, but here is the most comprehensive one that I have come across. Very important all around the world, all times of history, but especially in the Viking Age, the ones that were referred to as warriors were a separate social class of people in society. There were, and have always been, civilians in a society and warriors in a society. Civilians could fight sometimes, of course. If things got rough, they had to defend themselves. Of course, civilians took up arms. But it goes back to that idea that you saw in the movie 300.
You, what's your profession? I'm a potter.
Now, was his main function a warrior, or was he just fighting sometimes and he really had a different profession?
Spartans! What is your profession?
This is what the Viking Age was all about too. Most of the stories that we read about in the sagas and the chronicles and all like that, they're from the upper class, the warrior class of the time, which was a small percentage of the population. Yes, they did other things too. They could be farmers or fishers or whatever, but a large part of their profession was, their identity was being a warrior. We can't call just anyone who picks up arms and fought once or twice as a warrior. Just like a woman, or a child, or a cripple, or elderly, or anybody with opposable thumbs can pick up a weapon and swing it around, that doesn't mean that we can call them warriors. The reality is, in the Viking Age, fighting was reserved for the men in this war class. Yes, we do have a few sources of women fighting, but we have dozens, if not hundreds of sources of examples of civilians being protected. Before the men started fighting, they shout out to the other side and organize it between them. They organize the women, children, elderly, and even slaves to be escorted to safety before the fighting happens. There are far more records of this than anything else, and this was the norm in the Viking Age. There are exceptions, of course, but this was the norm. I've done other videos on all those sources you can check out here. However, there were some rare occasions where women were brought to battle. Let's go back to the origins of all this, the Germanic tribes where the Vikings are descended from. In a couple sources, women actually accompanied the men to battle to shout words of encouragement, show their tits, and with the impending threat of slavery if their men had lost the battle. This would bring such rage to the men that even from the deepest depths of the battle, where they were moments away from defeat, the men would reclaim the victory once they... Imagine once you felt this rage, and imagine we have no concept of what adrenaline is, of what our minds today know. Ancient humans would have regarded this spike in adrenaline as a frenzy, as something spiritual and divine. And a woman shouting encouragement from the side of the battlefield would have been considered like magic. Like, she shouts these words and shows her, bosom and those things, and you just get a rush of energy. They would have absolutely considered that something like sacred, like magic. Watch my whole video I did on that for some more info. And this is actually a tradition that lasted among the Germanic peoples for more than 1,000 years. There are a few Viking sagas recording like a witch usually hiding on the outskirts of the battle and casting magic in order for her family or friends to win the fight. That's maybe something a little bit different. But even the Normans, who were the Danes that actually settled in the north of France, they brought a witch with them to battle when they invaded England in the year 1066. Same thing, she cast magic and showed off her backside. The Normans now here were Christian even, but they were still bringing this woman to battle for this ancient purpose. Guys, this is about as far as the extent of women coming to battle was for. It was not to fight, but it was to provide support, magic, healing, those types of things on very rare occasions. That being said, though, if you brought some women to battle to provide support and you instructed them under no circumstances are you to set foot on the battlefield, some of these women would have done it anyway against the men's wishes, okay? So yeah, sure, women have a war spirit too, and they have love for their men just like anyone else. So if a woman ever saw her beloved brother or husband or father in trouble in battle, chances are that some woman wouldn't be able to stop themselves from rushing forward to help. This is exactly what happened in the Battle of Bråvellir. This source is regarded as a legendary saga, which means scholars have agreed that it was not a real historical event. I actually believe this battle really happened. The sources are just way over-exaggerated. For example, the battle was said to have 200,000 men fighting in this. This is 10, 20, 30 times larger than any of the largest battles of the Viking Age of the time. So if the battle actually did happen, the numbers were over-exaggerated at least 10 or 20-fold. So there was said to be in this source 300 women accompanying the Danes to the battle, so in reality it would have been less than 30 women. But in one part of the battle, a woman named Veborg rushed towards the battle after seeing her beloved champion killed by a rival champion named Starkad. He went after Starkad, who, by the way, he was said to be a giant with 8 arms. Just shows you the historical reliability of this source. But Veborg got to the front lines in order to try and fight him, but she was killed right away. There were other women too in this source described as fighting, but let's just say they didn't do very well, to put it mildly. But you can read the source and believe whatever you want. As always, links to the sources will all be below. We have another source that mentions a woman fighting, and she actually did do very well, and her name was Hervarar. Again, this source is regarded as a legendary saga, but it is linked to some real historical figures and events that may have taken place in the 4th and 5th centuries. This is what a lot of these movies and TV shows actually based their plots on, as this saga. Hervarar, she raided, she fought, she took part in battles, and she was by all means recorded in this source as the typical Wonder Woman, or Lagatha, or whatever girl power superhero you want to compare her to, and she was probably the only one ever that we could actually give this title of a warrior to. Again, it's a legendary saga, but you can give it a read and believe whichever parts of it you would like. What I want to make note of, though, is the sources that mention women participating in battle come from quite a bit before the Viking Age. Hervarar and the sources regarding her, the Battle of Bråvellir and Veborg. In another source, the Poetic Edda poem actually explains this pretty clearly. In Atlakviða, it's again a legendary source, but documenting some very real events and people, such as Attila the Hun. And in this part of the poem, it actually says that no other woman would ever go forward in armor after her. And in other sources, like Völsunga Saga and Nibelungenlied, it has a similar telling of this, that she was basically the last woman to armor up and go fight. Another source, Lagatha, actually, who you know, she was actually attested as fighting in a battle along with a few other women, as told in Gesta Danorum, again, not regarded as the most reliable source, but here she was listed as the last warrior woman. This would have been in the late 700s, if Lagatha really did exist, and Ragnar too at least did the stories, all the stories we know about them, are they true? After this, the sources detailing the Viking Age, we're talking post about the year 800-ish, that's when the sources actually start to get reliable, and we have a grand total of 0 women ever fighting in battle, or even being anywhere near the battle. None, guys. I know lack of evidence does not always prove lack of it happening, and this is often true with Viking Age sources, definitely. Christian writers and chroniclers did try to hide some things about paganism, but this is not one of those cases, not things like this. The chroniclers were writing everything they could to slander the pagans and their culture of the time. So if there were women fighting in battle, the authors of the sagas and chronicles would have been the absolute first to write about it. And there are hundreds of sources, both Scandinavia and foreign sources. We don't even have a hint at any woman was anywhere near battle during the Viking Age. So this kind of leads me to believe, from those sources, that there's maybe a small chance, you guys maybe get happy, but maybe a small chance that women warriors participated in battle somewhere from the 3rd to the 8th, 7th, maybe 8th century, and then it stopped. I maybe believe they fought in battle at that point, but at some point, early Viking Age or before the Viking Age, the men decided, okay, enough of this shit, we let you women come to battle for a few hundred years now, and look at all the problems we have. We lose the battles, heroes die, we get invaded by the Huns from the east, brothers against brothers, kingdom and empires fall. All of these things happen, guys. Lots of disastrous, catastrophic events. Also, a massive change in climate and some natural disasters. It was a warm and thriving period in the Germanic tribal age, as I like to call it, right about 2,000 years ago. Then some natural disasters happened, and they brought on a mini ice age starting about the 300s, 400s, and this led to the migration period. Does any of this sound familiar, the things I'm talking about? This was potentially a time in Germanic history where gender roles were being reversed a little bit. But eventually they said enough is enough. In fact, some scholars have actually theorized this. Judith Jesch and Jenny Jochens have theorized that all these stories about shield-maidens and their grim fates and the catastrophic events following them, and a lot of times their sudden switch back to their natural feminine roles is like a testament of the danger of abandoning the traditional gender roles. Almost like propaganda of the time, like all these shield-maiden stories were written as a lesson to not abandon the traditional gender roles of the society. I don't really agree with that. That's definitely not the only reason that they were written. I'm just saying, all around the world we find similar stories to this, where this theme of the moral of the story is don't abandon natural gender roles. You guys all know stories like these from around the world. So absolutely, I think the Viking Age was the start of an age where they took back the tradition and natural way of things, after they had been switched around for 300-400 years around the migration period. And that's why Scandinavia was so thriving at the time during the Viking Age. But I'm not saying that there weren't any tough women in the Viking Age that could fight at that time. For example, Freydis Eiríksdóttir in the saga of Greenlanders. She was an absolute beast of a woman, tough and strong. And one time in the story, when they settled Vinland and North America, she took up arms and beat her chest in order to scare away the Native Americans who had come on their property. Another time, she had her husband's men kill the rivals of a neighboring farm. They killed the men, but they refused to harm the women of the farm. So Freydis killed them herself. Freydis went after the woman herself because her husband and his men wouldn't do it. It just goes to show you guys, again, There's 1,000 sources for this. Women were protected in the Viking Age, and under no circumstances would a man harm a woman if he wanted to retain any honor in his life and in his community. We also have some domestic disputes where women could get a bit violent. In Laxdaela Saga, a man wanted to divorce from his wife. In Iceland, one way to get legal grounds to allow a divorce was if your wife was caught out in public wearing pants like a man. So he tricked his wife into putting on some pants, and she was the shame of a whole village, and she retaliated by chopping him near to death with an axe. So women definitely could fight, and they could get feisty for sure. But the husband's men, after they should retaliate against the wife, and he said, no, I deserve that. We can't harm a woman. Again, guys, does this sound like a society that sends their women to battle? No, it really doesn't. And finally, to address the last point, what about an invasion and defense? Could a woman fight back if the men were away? Sure. But most often they would have surrendered to an invading force or a party. But it is possible that sometimes the women may have taken up arms and fought back. We don't have any records of this happening in Scandinavia, but there's one foreign chronicle that wrote about the siege of Dorostolon. This was in the Eastern European area where the Rus Vikings settled, and the Prince Sviatoslav was away, and the Byzantines attacked Dorostolon, and they won the battle, and they documented that once they entered the city, they were stunned to see women fallen on the battlefield with weapons in their hands. Now, how close this culture was in the east of Europe to their distant Scandinavian cousins where they settled about 150 years ago, this is difficult to say, but okay, sure, we can say there's no reason that a woman could not take up arms and defend themselves when being invaded. I just would not say it's not the wisest decision. Something smarter might be like in Grettis Saga, for example. There was a band of berserkers that made their way into the feasting hall of a noble family homestead while the men were away. And they basically invaded, and they were going to do whatever they wanted with the women. So the women surrendered, and they ended up bringing them drinks and hosted them to get them drunk and off their senses, in order so that Grettir, who was a man just visiting for the moment, he could fight them and burn them in a barn when they were a bit drunk and incapacitated. Would that have turned out as well if the women decided to go Xena warrior princess and try and fight off the berserkers? Probably would have not ended as well. Another example on the larger scale, well, it's just a legendary battle, but I personally believe it happened, at least in some form. A Danish army invaded Sweden, and they won the battle there and killed the men. A Swedish noblewoman named Blenda led all the women. There's about 300 women, and they invited the Danish warriors into their hall for a banquet and a feast. So the 300 women flirted with the Danes, they served them drinks, and they got them drunk. And when the Danes passed out, the women killed them all in their sleep. So, if you ladies are ever getting invaded and the men aren't there to fight, just remember there are sometimes far better options than taking up a sword and fighting. Women are such amazing, they are and have always been, they're such creative, opportunistic thinkers, and their mind and social and emotional intelligence is far better than men, and their number one weapon, women have been whooping our asses for thousands of years with this weapon and this knowledge and creativity and intelligence that they have. So it would be smart for women to use that should the need ever come up, and not try to go all Lagatha, shield-maiden, warrior princess, but those are just my thoughts and what the sources say too. So, hope you enjoyed. That's all for today. In my next video, I'm not going to speak about any sources, just going to speak my personal opinions and logic, and that one's going to piss someone off. So good we have to go over the sources for this one, but that's all for today. Vi ses nästa gång.